even though I have, it still doesn't record everything. All right, so again, we kind of see this process develop through um, God's God's kind of like willing it and bringing it about and maintaining it. So, is it possible that God brought forth animals from the same material as human beings and could form those animals into different forms to the point even where it could resemble a human body? Sure. And I think we see that really when we understand what the chemical basis for all living things are, which is carbon. We're all carbon-based life forms, right? So maybe when it says that God out of clay made man, that what he's talking about is from the same materials that everything else comes from, God created this body, dust, carbon, where we all come from. So that's still true that God made everything from dust, but God also could have made these processes to develop human body from these lower beings. Sure, because what gives the being the actual identity, the form, the actual existence? It's soul, which can only come from God. Okay? So we would not look at Darwinism as a negation of creation. It's really kind of an understanding of maybe how God could have been a part of that and kind of maintained it. Now you could also hold that God also created human beings separately and made the body out of clay. Fine. There's nothing wrong with saying that either. When it comes to interpretation, the church does not give a definitive teaching on them.
What does the church say about? I've encountered these creationists who insist the world is created within 6
Yeah, yeah. So we started with that, Paul. Yeah, I think you weren't here yet. So we basically said that you can hold that as a Catholic. You don't have to necessarily say that God took billions of years to create everything, whatever. You could say because God does have the power and that authority to do that. Of course, he could have done everything in 7 days. But I think the question at hand is, how do we understand the word day? How is that defined? How is that governed? Is that a 24-hour period, or is that just really meant to kind of understand a period of time where God was actually working? So we, as a Catholic, you'd hold either one. But I think there's some legitimate questions can ask from creationists about like, okay, well, if God made everything in 7 days, how do we explain the fossil records and these other things we've discovered on Earth, sedimentary files, and like this understanding of these things? I think a creationist might say, well, yeah, because of our frail human understanding and our lack of comprehension, God made things to appear that way, but they weren't. Which I think raises another philosophical question. Well, why would God do that? I mean, could he do that? Sure. But why? Right?
Yeah, I mean, I know. I was watching what's his name on TV one time. The fundamentalist. I'm sorry, some students. I forget his name, but anyway, he insisted that one day was 25. Okay, yeah. He said that if you don't believe in creationism, you're not a Christian. Blah blah blah.
Yeah.
But to me, this is my interpretation. Okay, I'll give it to you.
Okay. Yeah.
One second. It's like a baby being born.
Mm-hmm.
It takes 9 months in the womb for the baby to develop.
Right.
You don't snap your fingers and a baby pops out.
Sure.
Right after.
Yeah.
Well, I think with creation of the world, it took from the beginning and in the universe 14 billion years ago. The Earth, according to science now, is 4.5 billion years.
Sure.
It took all that time to develop.
Yeah.
Just one example, the mineral. You had to have a great oxygen evolution where rocks became minerals, they
sure.
became calcium carbonate. That takes time.
Yeah.
And the whole thing takes time. And then throw in the physical constants, gravity, you know, the speed of light.
Mhm.
Everything had to be just so
Sure.
that they stood the concept in order for us to live on this earth.
Right.
Everything, you know, I've read a book about this. It's fascinating. All the different types of physical constants which just had to be just so
Right.
in order for us to live. The laws of nature. And God provided this, you know, the laws of nature, physical constants, the cosmic design, and so that we could live on this earth.
Right.
And it took him 14 billion years. Like it takes 9 months for 9 months for a baby to develop. It took about 14 billion years for the earth to develop so that we could live on it.
Yeah.
And I think that's much more awe-inspiring than thinking of God creating the day.
Yeah, and what I'm trying to convey here is that yeah, that we can hold those. Actually, as a Catholic, you can hold them, both of those to be true, and still call yourself Catholic, right? So I think there's more reasonable ways in understanding with development of science, and I think we as Catholics shouldn't fear development of science because all that really does, in the long run, is solidify the faith, right? So yeah, I would agree with you on that. I think that's what I've been trying to convey here for the last few minutes. But yeah, we want to be kind of open to interpretations and then maybe kind of ask those questions and maybe help understand the truth. So that's really what we're supposed to be doing, right?
Yeah, and then also to me explains evolution. And that evolution, you know, they say what happened by chance, but there was a driving force.
Yeah. So yeah, I think what the first story of Genesis tells us that God was creating these things through these processes, these laws of nature, and he, even though he's not bound by those laws, that's the way he's established to work. Because that's really makes the most sense from a physical standpoint, right?
Yeah.
I mean, could he blink things out of existence? Sure, he could, but the question is, why would he do that, right? He would. It seems like he's decided to develop these things over a constant period, and not just like. What we want to watch out for is what theists make a theist mindset. A theist would say that, yeah, okay, maybe God was present at the very beginning, kind of like a clockmaker. He wound everything up and then let it go. Well, that doesn't really seem kind of the way God's working either, because it seems like he's always involved with those developments and keeping those things in motion, in change. If he didn't, we would all just blink out of existence, right? So he has to be involved with it too.
Yeah, it has to be intimately involved.
Right.
You know, it just not haphazard.
Right.
And that's where the laws of nature, the physical constants come in. It's like the driving force.
Yeah.
Evolution wasn't just haphazard.
Right.
There's a scheme to it.
Yeah. There's
And-
development. And so that we would say that development was ordained by God too, ordered by God. So I think the I just want to point out, because I think you could read the Elohist version of Genesis and basically decide, okay, yeah, he was at the beginning, but then he just let it all. Now, the only thing that would negate that, I believe, would be the second chapter of Genesis, which actually is what we call the Yahwist story. Now, if the first chapter of Genesis is 10,000 foot view, chapter 2 kind of gives more detail and specifically focuses on the last of his creation, which was Adam and Eve. Right. So what's kind of fascinating about the second aspect of Genesis is how God kind of interacts with Adam. Like, for instance, it's very telling that the first thing that really God has Adam do is name all the animals. Now, why would that be significant?
Well, just like you're writing out all your zeros, Adam would still be naming insects. I mean, isn't that an indicator of dominion?
It is. So naming something, always and out forever, has always indicated responsibility or ownership, dominion, and dominion is the proper word. It's not domination. That's a different aspect. Dominion is harmonious. Dominion is using the gifts you're given towards their proper end. And so what dominion indicates here in this naming is that everything was rightly ordered in original time of creation towards its proper end. Right. And so this naming ritual, so to speak, was to give David, who was the highest created thing at the time, proper dominion over the rest of creation.
Adam,
What did I say?
David.
Oh, Adam. I'm sorry, Adam. Over creation. So this naming is really also not only that, but also it's supposed to help Adam understand in a deeper way God's relationship with him. Because one thing that was indicated, we have this original understanding of harmony, original understanding of justice, right? What doing, given what's due, what's due to the proper thing. But also, this actually is a way for God to help Adam understand original solitude. Because what happened in this naming ritual was Adam started to realize that there were these, everything had a mate. Everything that he was naming had another of it to have companionship and to have, a helpmate, so to speak. At that moment, Adam started realizing, well, wait, I'm the only one like me. And God did that for a particular reason. I think he did that because if God were to just make Eve right away, Adam probably wouldn't appreciate it as much what God was doing in creating. In other words, Adam had to use his gift of intellect to reason the situation he was in. And because of that, God then, who always had Eve in mind in his creation, his understanding, brought Eve from Adam to be a helpmate. So we have to understand there too, was Eve created individually in the same way? Was there development again of Eve from a lower species? Or okay, maybe. But it's significant that we have this the use of the rib, right? Really, that's more figurative to show that really Eve was of the same nature as Adam, and really was as intimate to Adam as his rib would be from the side, attached to the side, right? In the same way, Eve was meant to be that helpmate to him, right? It's also very interesting that it really makes a point to say they both were naked, which also indicates original innocence. That they weren't looking at each other as sexual objects or beings; they were looking at each other as those made in the image and likeness of God, with an own inherent dignity and respect.
The other creation was for sexual being.
Well, we haven't gotten there yet, right? So because we haven't really given that first commandment yet. It wasn't until Eve came about that God finally gave the command, be fruitful and multiply. But notice that Adam and Eve didn't do that right.
And all of these animals were just standing around waiting for Adam and Eve to do it, so they could do it.
Not necessarily, but we have an indication that we're actually doing that at the time. Which also shows kind of the harmonious action that was happening, right? And also kind of shows the dominion that Adam actually originally had over these animals.
Well, so is it the church's teaching, or as it is Genesis, that Adam was created as a man?
So, sorry, are you saying that he had genitalia as a man?
No, I'm saying, was he created as a full-grown man, or was he part of the,
Yeah, I mean, so obviously,
beings.
Adam and Eve would not have been fetuses, right? They would not have actually developed as human beings the same way as we do today. Now, would that mean they evolved from a lower species? Maybe. Was that species a full-grown species when it happened? Probably not. I mean, would the body been sired from another species and then developed? Maybe. Those are kind of open questions. I think you would hold though that Adam and Eve were at least at the age of reason, right, to actually make these determinations.
But they started at the age of reason, or did they develop and at a certain
they
point.
had to be at the age of reason just
Free.
because they wouldn't have been human otherwise. Right. So what I'm saying is it would not have been possible for them to actually be developed as fetuses. Right? They weren't human fetuses that became toddlers that became,
Okay, so there were all of these developing beings,
right.
and now they're, talking a lot about Neanderthals being,
Sure. Sure.
very much reasoning.
Sure.
And so it wasn't, I always assumed that at a point of development, then God breathed in that spirit
Well, okay, but
of beings
okay.
that were there.
So here's the thing, right? When you talk about spirit, again, spirit is indicative of personhood, which is indicative of identity, right? So would there have been a point in the life of the pre-human Adam where that would have happened? I think you could reason that, include that, right? So in other words, Adam would have been walking upright, would have had certain abilities, right, that you would recognize in any developed human outside the womb.
Well, and mature emotion, even.
Maybe. I mean, well, see, that's the other thing, though, too. In this understanding of Genesis, all the emotions were rightly ordered and governed by reason. One of the effects of the fall is that our emotions became disordered and even take precedence over our reason, which is why sin occurs. So it's hard for us to kind of understand that because we don't have that experience. But the understanding is that Adam was a being that had the gift of intellect, had reason, that his reason was governing properly his emotions and development.
And he would have had to have very sophisticated language.
Maybe. I mean, language. Yeah, language would have to be a part of indicative of rationality. Now, what that language was, who knows? But yeah, but also too, did you necessarily have to speak the name for it to be known? Right? God could have known that too, right? So he didn't say he actually spoke the name; he said he named it, right?
What's this? And so then God says, "Oh, you mean dog?"
Yeah, I mean, so that I think it's another indication that like God would have known what he was going to do, and that's also indicative maybe of what God knows. So when we talk about the knowledge of God, or like God understanding past, present, future all at once, right? God knows all the outcomes of every decision and what the possibilities are, right? But the gift of free will that was given to Adam through his intellect also allows us to actualize what was actually in potential. So in other words, God knows potentially everything that could occur and the effect of all those things all the way through infinity. But to actualize it, a choice has to be made by an intellectual being. Right? Which is where this choice came in. Adam could have named a bird an alligator, and that's how we would have known it. But still, he chose to name those winged things birds instead of an alligator. Okay, that actualizes the potential that could have happened, right? So God knew what he was doing with Adam, and he knew what Adam would do, but it didn't come to reality or existence until Adam did it, right? So he names him, realizes that he's alone, then comes on the scene Eve, which is part of God's plan from the very beginning. And the reason we know that is that the actual passage starts. This is. Let's see. He talks about the garden. Where's it here? There we go. The garden got to make grove. So the garden kind of talks about Eden. Eden is actually a specific place, and it's determined based on the geography is given here. It's probably around Mesopotamia and current day Iraq, which is kind of interesting. Yeah, because they talk about these four rivers, the Tigris, Euphrates, and these other two, and that kind of comes around that same area. But when he talks about the naming of the of these beings, he starts off with, it's not good for the man to be alone. Then he starts all the animals start naming them. So God knows, okay, I have this plan for him, but he has to realize it first. He has to understand it first before I actually give it to him.
I guess several of us are lucky he didn't settle for a dog and cat.
True. So we go through that process. Eve comes about, and again, this expression, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. And really, all the second chapter of Genesis kind of talks about this harmony that's happening in the Garden of Eden between Adam and Eve. All of God's creation, and everything's going well. They don't have to work very much. The land is plentiful and fruitful, and there's plenty of things to do and plenty of happenings happening. Things are great, peaceful. There's only one prohibition that God gives to Adam and Eve. You got these two trees in the middle of the garden. Don't eat of them, right? Don't do it. Now we may ask ourselves, well, what's that all about? Why would God create something and then put a prohibition? Well, we're told the true trees, the one is the knowledge of good and evil, the other one is the tree of life. We would probably posit the reason that God would put this prohibition is probably the same reason that he had Adam develop that understanding of his loneliness. They weren't ready to receive that gift yet. But through processes, the way God works in nature and through development and through these ways of maintaining his relationship with his creation, we would probably understand that was going to happen eventually. There would come to a point in their development that God would say, you know what? It's time for you to receive this gift. It just so happened that in Genesis chapter 3, there was kind of a break in that plan. Now, you could even argue, well, then what's this whole thing about this serpent? Why would God create the serpents to actually do all this? It seems like the serpent was the thing that's disordered, not necessarily Adam and Eve. Well, again, we're looking at, we have an interpretation of the Bible in kind of three different ways. So we have a literal interpretation, what the words actually mean, what they're saying. We have a spiritual interpretation, which takes kind of three aspects. And the question we have to ask ourselves when reading the Bible, anything in the Bible, is this an allegory? Is it a moral? Or is it anagogical, meaning it has something to do with the end times? In this respect, I think that the implication of the serpent is actually anagogical. It's kind of talking about these spiritual things that are happening that affect the end, the goal of humanity. And the serpent really is representative of the evil one, right? Satan, who wants to be like God and is jealous, so to speak, whatever that means for an angel, of God's creation. Perhaps because God showed such affection and love and attention to this creation, that the higher order of spiritual beings maybe felt slighted, whatever it means to feel from an angel. I don't know. But we can glean from that is that a choice was made by the angel Lucifer to choose not God. And not only choose not God, but also to try to bring his creation with him.
But the angels made for humans?
So that's hard to understand, Paul, because we're talking about in the heavenly realms, talking about something that's outside of creation is also outside of time and space. So when we talk about God created heaven, that's true. But heaven is not like this patio. It's not like it's a place that we actually like physically can go to. It's really more of a state of existence. And so when we talk about time in heaven, that's really difficult to talk about because there isn't time in heaven. So when we say about God creating the angels before earth, well, I mean, it's really one full act of creation. And for us, that's hard to really kind of put into words because we can't really comprehend that. right? We are governed by an order of time and space that things like angels are not governed by. So I can't answer that because it's hard for me to even interpret that.
I was, this was my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong.
Sure.
God created before Earth, before what we call the universe creation. God was with his angels.
Sure.
Created, or he begot Jesus, and then the angels came.
Well, okay, no, okay, well, even that is difficult because the triune God has always been. And so even saying to begot Jesus, right? Oh, okay, Jesus was always there. It's not like God the Father existed and then all of a sudden popped out, Jesus the Son and then the Holy Spirit. They were all together at once. And so they're separate, but they're not. It's not like, again, it's kind of, we're trying to put things in understanding of time. That's something outside of time, right? And to say how that actually works, I can't tell you. But when it comes to
that God, first of all, before and he created angels, and he was happy with them. Okay, they're here to serve me, blah blah blah. And then according to the book of Revelation, had a big civil war. One third angels, and it created hell came about.
Okay. Yeah. So Revelation, again, it's a vision that John's having. And whether that's a lucid dream or actually like the actual waking vision he's having, we don't know. But it's something that's happening truly to him. That's being revealed in a way that's not in the physical way. So in other words, maybe a good analogy I can put in this. Let's say I want to build this table, right? There's a process I go about to building the table. I got to get the materials, I got to get the screws, I got to get the glue. I have to attach one thing one time, and that happens over a process of time, right? In heaven, though, it's not like that happens. It exists because God wills it to exist, and that doesn't happen in a process or in time and space. It just does. And so the same way we talk about like this understanding of the creation of heaven and earth, I mean, they're kind of created in the same way as God willed it, but it's not like it's a chronological order of creation in the same way we actually witness in the physical world. So to say that God created angels in heaven and then hell and then earth, okay, that's a way for us to kind of understand it in some ways, but it actually happened that way. I can't tell you. Nobody can tell you that. Right. Right. So that's what I'm saying. I mean, when we talk about even when she's exemplified with the whole, well, God creates angels, happy with them. Well, okay, maybe. But when you're talking about things outside of time and space, that's really hard to distinguish. I think it's a way for us to maybe understand in some ways, maybe how God works, but that is not a full picture of the way God creates.
Well, it's hard for me trying to think of reality with no time because we're all linear. We're thinking linear.
Exactly. Right.
Okay.
Right.
What's no time? What's that?
Right. And that's what I'm saying. We were talking about things outside of this of the universe, out of the created existence. It's hard for us to really put that into words because we can't do it without time and space. Right.
But there's time in purgatory.
Well, see, that's an open debate too, right? I mean, so we talk about purgatory again as a state. It's a state of existence.
But isn't there a measure of sentencing?
I mean, I think traditionally we've always kind of talked about that way, but see, again, that understanding is not coming from a definitive teaching of the church. It's coming from personal revelation, right? And we always want to be very careful about that because great saints can talk about like, oh, I witnessed purgatory and I saw people that have been there for 1,000 years. It's like,
Yeah, that going on in the roads of your
well, we'll see. And the thing is like, well, maybe, I mean, maybe the best thing we could say about that is maybe, because the way the Church of Italy talks about these what we call these anagogical states, these theological the end times. Heaven, hell, and purgatory are not like physical places and spaces. They're not governed by time. They're states of existence. And so heaven is the perfect state of existence where we're with God for eternity, right? In complete fulfillment and contentment. Is wonderful. Hell is the complete opposite of that. And purgatory is just a state of getting rid of these attachments that we have to earthly things. Now, time frames on that, I mean, I think a lot of that depends on the particular soul. And maybe we all go through a purgation at the same time or in the same kind of condition, or maybe it is like some personal revelation says, like a burning away of these things, like a purging burning, maybe. Some theologians posit it's like the actual the allegory or the parable of the prodigal son. That's just more of like a longing for the entrance into heaven, and that longing separates us from these earthly attachments, allows us to go in perfectly, and where the Father turns to us and runs to us. Is that a time? I don't know.
But
I'll share with you something I read. It's about a saint who was a priest, and he had his friend at the time who was a priest also, and they made an agreement. If one of them died before the other one, that priest would say a mass for the deceased, so he would go to heaven or something like that. They would pray for him, and so his friend did die, and then he came back. That day he couldn't say the mass for him then because he had to do something. That evening, the deceased priest came to him and said, "Why didn't you say a mass for me? I'm in purgatory. I've been here so long." And he thought to himself, "Wait a minute, it's only been a day.
Yeah, right. Yeah,
How
yeah,
can
yeah.
you complain about
Give
that?"
me a minute.
And he said,
that
he
also.
realized, well, there's no time in purgatory.
Right.
So for that priest, he'd been there probably felt like forever.
Yeah.
But
It's again, and it's also personal interpretation too, right? That's personal revelation.
But if that, from everything I've heard, several people, priests, any prayer that you said now, today, for George Washington was available to him, the grace of that prayer, when he died.
Yes.
Okay, well, that story and the other one, the Gregorian Mass story, where you can have, I don't know where you get the priest to do it, a priest say a mass every day for 30 days, and then that person will be released in heaven. Well, if that priest was saying a mass every day for 30 days, he would have gone to heaven when he died.
Sure. Yeah. Right. Well,
Who
and
makes up
again,
this stuff?
I mean, that's what I'm saying. It's like we're trying to put comprehension on something that's outside of the governing of these physical realities we experience, right? And so I think the best we can say about prayers and masses is that they're certainly efficacious, right? They affect in some way the soul in purgatory. How or who they apply to or how that works, that's really up to God, right? So you should do them because they do help. But how they help and who they help and how long and how much they help, that's not up to me. That's up to God and the individual, right?
You called this meeting.
Right. Right. So I think the most we can all say about all these things is maybe, right?
But back to God the Father, Jesus even called the Father, and Jesus. Why wasn't Jesus? I mean, he was kind of foretold by other people.
Yep.
But why wasn't he revealed in the Old Testament as the Son of God?
Well, because the humanity after the fall wasn't ready to receive it that. Right. So if you look at the Old Testament itself, God incrementally reveals things over time based on the development, right? So like you could say the same thing about like, well, why would God tell all the the Israelites to go on campaign against these people, their neighbors, who are trying to kill them? Why don't we just use the principles Jesus taught them of love and peace and harmony? Okay, well, if they did at that time, they would have been destroyed by their neighbors who wanted to kill them, right? So, in other words, there had to be development of the human understanding that was caused by the fall. So, who's to say that Adam and Eve didn't experience the Trinity in the way it was before the fall? Because they were in this capacity to do that, and maybe they were. That's what makes the fall so significant. Is that not only these things like breaking of our immortality, right? That we experience suffering and pain and turmoil and death, but also this knowledge that was had, these what they call it preternatural gifts are given in the very beginning. A lot of those were lost, including possibly this knowledge of, or at least this understanding of the Trinitarian aspect of God. And then God had to reestablish that over time because humanity, because of that fall, had to grow again in their understanding.
Well, and I mean, everything is a domino effect because of these two knuckleheads
Yep.
who listen to it.
Right.
But that seems draconian in that God is all-knowing and knew everything that was going to happen.
Yep, right.
More. And that sin was passed
Mhm.
to people unknowing, and those who really can't even do anything about it. I mean that's what they do in North Korea. I mean, when you're in prison, so are the next 4 or 5 generations.
Okay, yeah.
But I don't know. I guess I
So
don't.
is
doubt
the question you have, if I can just paraphrase, what you're asking is original sin, right? Why does that affect everybody else?
Well,
Okay, and I have the answer for you. So here's the thing, right? Let's go turn to chapter 3 of Genesis. Let's kind of actually just read the text. So, the snake goes to Eve. Does he really say can't eat anything garden? He said we can't eat everything except for the fruit of the garden and the milk of the trees. The middle of the garden that God said we shall not eat it or even touch it, or else you will die. So the snake does this thing. He says the eyes of both of them were open and they knew that they were naked. So they sewed fig leaves together and made loincloths for themselves. At this point, God knew what they did, right? God, it's not like this was hidden from him. He knew what they did. When they heard the sound of the Lord God walking about in the garden at the breezy time of the day, the man and his wife hid themselves from the Lord God among the trees of the garden. The Lord God then called to the man and asked him, "Where are you?" That's also very significant because God knew he knew what they were. It's not like he didn't know what they were doing or what they did. But what this was an opportunity. What it could have answered, what he answered was, "Are you in the garden?" But I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. Then God asked, "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I have forbidden you to eat?" That kind of calls him out. Not that he already knew this, right? Again, I'm giving you opportunity. The response was, "The woman you put here with me, she gave me the fruit from the tree, so I ate it." It was her.
Well, I wonder all along.
And then her response was, "Well, the snake tricked me, so I ate it." You put the snake here, not me. You put her here, not me. Right? What exactly? So it's not the fact they actually ate it was really the problem. That is not what actually caused the original sin to happen. It was their fact they didn't come forward and say, "I'm sorry." Right? It was that action.
These people who've only been people for a little bit.
Well, we don't know that. We don't, Christine, you can't say that. We know that they were created and they actually with that.
Okay.
And what caused such the distraction and such an impact on it was the fact that they denied that very gift. And if they would have come, and this what I think this is kind of an interesting factor. That what I would posit is if they would have at that moment said, "Look, I'm sorry I did this. I know it was wrong, and I want your I apologize." You think God wouldn't forgive them?
No. It sure would have changed things.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot less headache for God.
And for us,
Now, I always thought of original sin as human nature.
yeah, no,
as
I
our
think,
tendency
yeah,
to-
so I think that that became part of human nature. But if you look at the original, if you look at the Yahweh and the Elohim version of Genesis, that was never the original intention. Our wills, our nature were actually designed for good, and they were completely in line with God's will. That's what caused the choice to actually not only eat the fruit, but then also from the fruit of that, the fruit, so to speak, was to deny this gift from God and actually blame Him for it.
So, I never remember. I'm usually going to sleep when I'm listening to these, but someone, I don't know, maybe it was even you, said that knowing that personally would have been enough to put Adam and Eve in heaven.
Yeah.
So all of the havoc that they,
Well, I mean, the thing is, yeah, the problem is there has to be consequence for what they've done. I mean,
but
to break an eternal law,
yeah,
an eternal divine law, would
but
have an eternal divine consequence.
it wasn't hell,
Um,
or
well,
we don't suspect.
we
it was.
what I mean, so after the death of Adam and Eve, they couldn't go to heaven. We know that, right?
Well, until the resurrection,
Right,
but
Right.
then they could
Right.
because they knew.
right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah. I mean, even but what's even fascinating more is so after that interaction with Adam and Eve, God then incurs the punishment, right? And then what's actually interesting about that is in chapter 4. In chapter 4, you hear about Cain and Abel, right? So of course the story goes that Abel, he was a farmer. No, I'm sorry, a rancher. Cain was a farmer. Abel took the first fruits of his flock and offered to God. Cain kind of got leftovers and offered to God. And because of that, God accepted Abel's sacrifice and rejected Cain's. Again, an impact of concupiscence next fall. What's kind of interesting though is in the interaction, we kind of hear the same interaction between Cain and Abel's parents and God when this happened. After then Cain got jealous, killed Abel. So basically what the Lord says to Cain, why are you angry? Why are you rejected? If you act rightly, you'll be accepted. But if not, sin lies in wait at the door. Its urges for you, that you can rule over it. So basically what God's telling you, the reason I rejected your offering is because your brother gave me the first fruits. You gave me the dregs. Do better. you have control. You can control yourself. I've given you this gift of intellect to control your emotions. And I know you had the fall, I know you had this original sin, but you can still do better. So what does Cain do? So Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. When they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord asked Cain, where is your brother Abel? Again, it's like, do you not know? Does he not know? Of course he knows. He answered, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And of course, God then said, what have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are banned from the ground. Then open his mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. Again, what's interesting in these first aspects of Genesis is God is trying to give opportunities for them to repent and turn back, and we don't. And so it wasn't just Adam and Eve in their generation that did this. It was even their offspring that did it.
But as the church,
Yep.
we believe that these people existed in these people, not this is lesson given to the world.
yeah, again, I think we could say that these are, um, if anything, allegory, right? Right. But I think it's also a way to show how God still interacts with us, even in the midst of our turning away. And that's really the effective. That's really what original sin is.
Uh-huh.
Is that because our parents keep turning away from Him, right? That's why the progenies are also given that same issue, right? So Adam and Eve sinned, they turned away from God, even though they weren't designed that way, which caused this eternal break. And because they at that point they were the only humans who ever exist, that then affected their progeny. It was actually more fascinating about that is it, Adam and Eve didn't start having kids until after the fall.
And how many did they have and how long did they have?
Well, there's certain traditions that say they had like 50, actually, as a matter of fact, let me see here. Well, they had 3 that were known for the Bible. Okay.
Progeny wise.
Adam was 133 years old when he begot his son in his likeness. So this is, Abel. And then, and named him Seth. So basically, from Cain and Abel, Cain was banished. It was said, certain traditions hold, and these are not biblical, these are not really part of the Jewish Old Testament, but that Seth took one of his sisters. One of his sisters actually was meant for Abel. I'm sorry, Cain took one of his sisters meant for Abel and took her off with him and caused other issues. Seth was sired at 137 years old. Adam lived 800 years after he begot Seth and had other sons and daughters. The whole lifetime of Adam was 930 years. Then he died.
So Eve must have kept right up with him if they were.
You would imagine.
They were all these.
Right.
So if things had worked out in the garden and Adam repented or they didn't, they weren't having sex then? Is that the interpretation?
Yeah, so
Would
they
we
didn't
be here?
they didn't have children until after the fall.
So if things had worked out, it just would have been Adam and Eve.
No, not necessarily. So there's thought that maybe God would still have had a way for, because he also gave he gave the command, be fruitful and multiply before the fall, right? But they didn't start having kids till after. Now, is it possible that God could have created others like Adam and Eve in the same way? Sure. Maybe that was the original plan. But when the fall occurred, well, now we have a way to actually bring about, creation, other people. But I think it's also important to point out too that before the fall, well, Adam and Eve still had genitals. They still had sexuality, right? And so it's maybe indicative that God always had the plan of the marital act to bring about children. But the difference would be that before the fall, it would have been an act of pure love. Whereas after the fall, it becomes kind of an act of lust. What's interesting, what kind of underscores that is Saint Augustine in Casti Connubii, I think it's Casti. He writes that really one of the great, and this is really before the theology was developed on holy matrimony, but he said one of the really great, the real purpose of holy matrimony is so that, great. So yeah, it's so these interpretations I think we kind of can hold, and we can have others too. I mean, it's just so again, there's not really necessarily definitive way to interpret these things, but I think we have to ask ourselves what makes the most sense, and what has kind of been revealed in other ways, right? So that's kind of the purpose of Genesis, and I think it's kind of a good way we can interpret that, right? And that actually goes along a lot with John Paul II's theology of the body. As a matter of fact, John Paul II uses Genesis 1-3 to kind of develop the understanding of sexuality and the gift that actually is from God. Of course, Theology of the Body is a very long tome. It's basically taken from his audiences on Wednesday audiences from 1979 to 1984. So it's really rich. And one thing about John Paul II is that his writing style is very poetic, but also very philosophical. So you can get into the weeds very quickly. But that's kind of the point he makes in Theology of the Body, is that this physical aspect of marital love seems like the resurrection. Right? Experience Christ coming on earth and Christ remaining with us on earth. And that's a great gift that our ancestors before Christ didn't have until Christ died for them and was able to bring them into the gates of heaven. We have the opportunity now. We don't have to wait for it, right? We can actually enter heaven if we want to, because of the sacrifice of Jesus. But again, that doesn't mean we can do whatever we want. That means we are called to follow God's will, follow his law, follow the teaching of Jesus, and do the best we can. And when we do fail, which is inevitable because of the fall, we shouldn't be like Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. We should actually seek that forgiveness and try to receive that mercy.
The nature of man is inclined towards sin, right?
Well, I wouldn't argue that. What I would say is that we understand in the first 2 chapters of Genesis, man and woman was made good, right? We were made for good, and so we're directed towards that good. That's our goal. That's our end. But we don't do it perfectly, right? We still let other things get in the way from that goal, and so like that's when we're talking about this disorder. One of the effects of the fall was that while Adam and Eve, they were perfectly ordered in their emotions towards their intellect. Their intellect was governing their emotions well and properly. The fall caused emotion to kind of take over. We saw that in the story of Cain and Abel. Anger, right? Rage, wrath. That's the human emotion. If Abel was actually using his reason, he would have listened to God and said, okay, I'll do better next time, instead of taking it out on his brother. But that was the effect of the fall. So again, when we're talking about sin, the nature of sin, when we sin, I think what the church teaches that typically we're looking for is a good. The sin is not choosing the good, it's actually choosing the lesser good over the higher one. So, well, it's not necessarily disordered. So, like, for instance, we're talking about the marital act. Let's talk about sex. Why not? If your goal in sex is to just receive pleasure, pleasure is not inherently bad. It's not bad to want or desire pleasure or even have pleasure. The problem with sex, though, is that pleasure is not the actual true end of the action. The purpose of that action is to unify two people and potentially, not always, but potentially, bring about a new creation. That's the goal and the purpose of it. The means of getting there is pleasure, or else nobody would do it. But if I'm just doing that action for pleasure, I'm not actually wanting the end and the actual purpose of that action. I'm wanting the lesser good as my end. And that's where the sin lies. Right? It's the more proximate, lesser good I'm choosing over the higher, better good to what's actually being directed. So, I mean, let's take a little more, a better example, maybe, or a little more, less, I don't know, sexualized. Food. It's not wrong to enjoy an ice cream cone. There's good in that, right? There's pleasure in that. There's satisfaction in that. But when I turn that ice cream, if I have 5 ice cream cones, well, that's a problem. Because I'm now not necessarily looking for the ice cream cone for the pleasure it's giving me, or even the actual nutrition. I'm looking at just purely the pleasure of eating, which is a lesser good than the actual nutrition the ice cream cone is actually giving. And that's where gluttony comes in, right? Lust. It's choosing the pleasure over that actual ordered end of that action, right? Greed. Well, I just want more and more and more, instead of what actually I just need to provide for myself and even provide for a good life for myself or my family. that's the true end of accumulating means.
Aquinas say you gotta find a happy medium in the virtues.
Well, virtue, what he says is virtue is always the mean between two vices, right? So in other words, when you talk about things like, let's say, temperance, right? So when we talk about temperance, on one side, well, that God doesn't want that either, because that causes, nutrition deficiency and problems, health problems. But temperance is mean between those two. So I can overindulge, and I can just get really, really extreme to the other side. Think of like, was it bulimia? What's the other side? The other one? What's the one you don't eat anything? Anorexia, bulimia, right? Those are the two extremes, and the center is a healthy eating habit, right?
Can't find that.
Right. So that's where virtue is. We think of virtue as like these two as the opposite of vice, but virtue actually, as Thomas would argue, is the mean between two vices. Okay. So yeah. Great. Well, thank you for coming, everybody.
All right, well, thank you.
We'll see everyone next week for By the Father, maybe. I don't know. We'll see. I don't know.
All right.
Already.